Welcome, everyone. Glad everybody could join us here. Um, in case you didn't know where we are, this is our session to talk about how to solve audio issues that you didn't have. And my name is JANETZKI, and I'm a broadcast engineer and a systems integrator for the last 30 years. And there's a lot of things that we've stumbled upon of challenges that you guys face in terms of tech for your church and being a good steward of what you have as far as resources and finances. But what I want to try to do today is kind of highlight a couple of the things that you might come across. Some may be obvious to you, and some hopefully maybe it'll be like a light bulb moment for you. And to start off with, a couple or a few of the most common issues that people have in their church environment. The number one is just an uneven SPL, which is a sound pressure level throughout the room.
One moment.
Somebody saying 1 moment? Anyway.
Still working.
Oh, who's that? There's somebody in my box talking to me here. Wow, I didn't know she was there.
Please try again.
I'm not sure what that one is. It's almost like it's one of those Siri things, but I don't have her. Okay, anyway, well, we will go back here like this. All right. Anyway, the way that the evenness of your room and the coverage that you get from your speakers or whatever, that's what we're talking about. And oftentimes it's very inconsistent as far as that sound pressure level goes. And all that's to say, it might be very loud for the people in the front room, and as you get towards the back, it's very quiet. And traditional line arrays that you may be familiar with, they start to solve some of those issues by getting more sound energy to the back of the room and less to the front, so at least it's a bit more even. The second problem that we seem to find is that there are inconsistent frequency responses within the space. And when you have multiple point sources, or basically multiple speakers, they interact with each other and they cause what's called comb filtering in the room. And a line array traditionally is made up of several different speakers, all aimed at a different area. And when you start adding those frequencies together or putting multiple boxes together, some of those frequencies will add together and get louder, and others will cancel each other out. And so you might find somebody sitting in this seat over here, they can hear the 2K frequency range really well, but somebody over here, they're not getting it at all. And that imbalance is quite significant, and you've probably heard that in the spaces in your worship. But this comb filtering that happens, it's quite dramatic. If you just add one additional point source to a room, it's more than just like adding one comb filter to it. The algorithm that used, or the function that you use to figure out, is you multiply 2 times the number of point sources that you have, and that's how many comb filters that end up being in. It's exponential. And so if you think, okay, this church has got a line array here, it may have 6 or 7 point sources inside of it, and then you got one on the left or the right side. Maybe you have delay speakers, maybe you have monitor speakers for your worship team. Well, let's just say that you have 20 speakers in the room now that are all being functional. Well, if you figure out what the comb filter is there, you'd have over 1 million comb filters at that point. They're all interacting with each other. So, but if you remove one speaker, well, now you would be able to square root that number, and now that number drastically starts to reduce. And so the key thing to remember is the fewer number of point sources you have in the room, the more of a dramatic effect that will have, and keeping that comb filtering under control. The other thing that you're probably familiar with is signal-to-noise ratio, and that's the difference between the noise floor that's in the room or inherent in your system. So that might be microphone preamps, different processing outboards. So it's the difference between the noise that's there and the actual signal level that you have. So the higher number of that ratio that you can get, the better. So infinity signal-to-noise ratio would be excellent. However, above 80 is usually what's considered good. So keeping those into consideration as far as on all levels of your sound chain from the beginning to the end. So those are the two the big things, sound pressure level and inconsistent frequency response. Let's see. Third problem that we have arises, and it has to do with distortion. And most people don't realize that distortion drastically changes changes the experience that you have sitting in the seats here. It's one of the most significant factors, and it's probably even more significant than all those comb filters that are happening, because it's in every single system. The distortion is just, there's no way to completely eliminate it. But if we can reduce it, then that's going to make the listening experience better for your audience. Normally, most speaker systems, they use what's called a compression driver. And that's an image of that there. And they have a very slow transient response, so they aren't fast moving when you're changing frequencies on there. And because of that, it's funneling a larger surface area through a compressing it, and now that's how it gets amplified by going out through the wider aperture there. And that's how it creates gain, and it increases SPL. However, this technology has a very high THD, which is total harmonic distortion. And those are figures that you'll see on your speakers and microphones. Everything is measured in THD. And the higher the compression ratio that's happening, well, the higher that THD number is going to be, and that is going to equal distortion. THD also increases with frequency. So when I'm speaking, I've gotten certain tonality to my voice, and then you may have a female singer, and she'll have different spectral content that her voice sounds like. And this all can be kind of hard to wrap your mind around because it's all affecting each other. But as an example, to prove this to you, in terms of how significant this is, how many people here actually mix in their church? How many people are actually, okay, we got a few, yeah. So I'm sure that you've probably had to play back an audio track, and you cue it up on a CD or a drive or whatever, and so you say, oh, this doesn't sound really great, let me EQ it. And so you EQ it, and you add a little bit of highs here, and you cut some lows out. And then, all right, this one sounds great. So you're playing it. And then you go get another track, the next one. And now that one doesn't sound anything like what you just EQ'd. You're like going, so you have to retweak that one. Well, finally you get it happy. And you can say you can live with this, but the other track, there's no consistency there. And now it sounds like rubbish again. And the reason is distortion. That's what that effect is. The program content of what you're playing is different between one music track and the next. So this THD, how much of the THD is contributing is different depending on the frequencies that are in those songs and the different sounds that are there. If any of you guys have ever tuned your room or something and played some pink noise and that kind of thing, normally you would go through and you would send a test signal in throughout the speakers and then use the EQ to kind of level that all out. Well, but a really flat track sounds horrible, so then you're forced to put some of those frequencies back in until it sounds great. And the problem is, though, when you're mixing, you're adjusting, you have to be aware that you're actually compensating for the distortion, and because the distortion is adding, it just makes it more difficult. And when you play different music content, it's going to be completely different. And it's even the difference between the sound of like an electric guitar and acoustical guitar. That's where this problem comes into being then. Another issue that you guys are probably all familiar with is the reflections. Now, this is really important for churches because this is where most churches here will say, oh, we've got a great room. It sounds good in there. And I bet almost every single one of you that says that, I would say, well, but it could be better. Obviously, direct sound is the most important. And that's the signal coming from the point source. It could be me as a speaker or a speaker as a point source coming to you. Indirect sound is then where it's bouncing off of the walls and the ceilings. And when they arrive at the listener's ears at different times, it masks the direct sound and it causes more of this comb filtering. So we already know we got comb filters between the speakers. Well, now you got to factor in that I've got comb filters between the speakers and the room. More things to deal with. So this problem is probably one of the most important issues that you could address to make the sound at your church the best that it possibly could be. And I'll tell you why. It's not just sound quality as in it sounds good, but it's also when you're talking about church and the spoken word, now we bring in something called listener fatigue. If you guys have ever sat in a cafe where you try to listen in on the conversation of somebody else, or you're trying not to listen into their conversation, you know what I'm talking about. If there's background noise and there's other people talking, and traditionally in a room like this, and I'm talking to you, there would be sound coming off of the walls and the ceiling. Well, then that is dealing with your brain having to focus out on those things. You're hearing the speaker come, or the sound come from all around you rather than the direct source in front of you. So your brain is needing to focus out what's going on in the room and to focus on my voice or the speaker's voice. And that's when listener fatigue comes into play with pastors. When they're preaching for an hour or preaching for 2 hours or whatever, that's where the system really needs to minimize what's happening in the room, minimizing these reflections that are coming from everywhere. God has perfectly and purposely created our brain to be very clever. He knows how to, it knows how to cancel the reflections out and how to focus on me and not like this. It's almost like eye strain, but it's called hearing strain. And you're not thinking about it, but you just know that it's so difficult to focus on that guy talking. And in the meantime, it's easy to shut off and start thinking about, well, who's playing football next, or what am I going to do after church, and get distracted. Some of the speaker's positions are really difficult to deal with because they direct energy at that back wall over there, and it's bouncing straight back in your face. And if you've, as worship leaders, is something I'm sure you experience that in different venues that you may have come to. And this happens to be known as the direct to reverberant field ratio. If I'm at that back wall, it actually sounds better than it does at the front wall. Because when I'm at the back wall, the sound that's bouncing off of the back is almost at the same time that the direct sound is getting to me. That's a very short distance between there. So now it's louder though, because it's adding, I'm getting direct and the reverberant sound coming back to me. The worst seats, however, are in the middle of the room where you folks are there. And that's because you're hearing a long delayed reflection coming off of that back wall, and that's interfering now with the direct sound that's coming from the speakers. Typically, the guy at the front gets blasted, and the sound guy is probably in the back. He's in the cheap seats back there. Well, it sounds okay to him because he's pretty close to the back wall there, but the people in the middle are the ones that are usually suffering and trying to stay focused. So try it out next time at your church if you want. You put some music on and go stand next to the back wall. It'll sound better than if you come to the front. And it's also true about the edges of the room, depending on the amplification system that you have. So let's talk a little bit about some of the inherent issues that we have in today's speakers then. One of the problems is where we point the speaker. Normally, you kind of focus 3/4 down the room, but the reality is it's actually directing half of that energy up to the ceiling. So only half is all that you're using. And look at where your speakers point at your next time you go into your own church, because where they're pointing is probably a lot of that energy is being lost up into the ceiling, and then that's causing reflections that are coming down. Line arrays now that are in a lot of churches actually help that, because they can actually throw more energy to the back of the room than they do to the front. So that's great that you can get that consistency there. The problem is with line arrays, though, is they're only optimized for the center of the room or in a straight line. And this is a big deal because geometrically from me to the back room there is a short distance here, but from me over to the corner over there, that's a longer distance, and they can't compensate that. So I can optimize only for the front to the back, but not to the edges, or especially in the corners that are happening. But by the time that line array is getting to the back, if you think of how they are, there's one on top that's pointing straight back, and then they're curved down a little bit. Well, that one in the back is firing against the very back wall, and that's just coming straight back at the stage now at that point. And most of that energy is now hitting the back wall and causing a really bad reflection. So they're fantastic for working in a very small aperture of space this way, but horizontally, they really don't have any control, and it's not matched to the room because room sizes are all designed differently. How many people have line arrays in their church now, I think? Okay, a couple. I would guess that you also know where the dead spots are in there too. You've had people complain about it. Oftentimes, it's the pastor's chair right in the front. And then you end up having to put front fills in to kind of compensate for that. So those are kind of inherent issues then with line arrays. Another problem that we have is with conventional speakers, again, has to do with the reflections that we were talking about. We're trying to minimize the reflections off the walls, but we need to be careful where we are directing that energy. So we don't want excessive energy in the room. You either design a sound speaker system for a room, you have two choices. You either overshoot the room and all the energy hits the walls, or you undershoot the room and then now you have all of these holes everywhere. So you have to decide that's a very tricky spot to be in, to figure out, well, what compromise can I make between over and undershooting the room? You've only got the ability to basically cover everybody and keep covering the room, or to cover a small amount of people and minimize the reflection. The problem is that architects, they don't like designing rooms to match the pattern of a speaker box. And most speaker boxes are 90 degrees by 50 or 60 degrees by 40, but they don't like designing rooms for that. So the problem exists also with line arrays that way. It solved the problem in one dimension, but now on the horizontal dimension, it's still inferior. So if you try to cover the outside areas, then that means we're going to overshoot the room, and now all the energy is going to the back just to cover the front of the auditorium. So steered columns came into being, and that's what a lot of people are talking about now, and they use a couple different technologies. There's some great benefits to using those in your space. However, there's downfalls as well. The steered columns generally use what's called a Fresnel function. If you did lighting, you're familiar with a Fresnel lens. It basically is defocusing and focusing the sound to create the beam that they want to do. And so they're saying this is a steered column, and they can either send more energy to the back that way. And it does reduce the room reverberation quite significantly. But then again, we have this problem with the horizontal plane on there that it doesn't help on there. It's only able to handle like a line array to the end, to the front and back. And there is direct sound coming out of the bottom because it's kind of able to keep that off the ceiling. So that's a good spot to be in. However, it's still hitting as you get to the back of the room, about 6 up the back wall, in case people stand up, so you want to cover that, and now you have a lot of energy then coming back into the face of the stage area. So it's good, but just it's not good enough. So with all these issues that we've been revealing, what if we could actually shutter the sound to cover the audience and keep the energy off the back wall and the ceilings? Because if we could control energy off that wall, and the ceiling, that's a 300% improvement from the steered column, which was doing pretty well. And what if we could also minimize the number of point sources in the room all the way down to 2 and exponentially reduce the comb filters? 2 to the power of 2, that's only 4 comb filters as opposed to the multitude that you get with other speaker technologies. And what if we could eliminate compression drivers completely and now optimize the THD problems that we were having and the distortion issues that we talked about? And that's exactly then where these speakers come into being. They give us the ability to shoot exactly where you need the sound to go. And so if you're not familiar with this technology, it's been around for 6 or 7 years. It was developed in Sydney, Australia by a brilliant man. And he's actually designed several amplifier modules and stuff and patents, and they're in most of the other loudspeakers. But when he came up with this and the algorithms that he's using to do this, he decided that he was going to stop down and take this. He put this in his church down in Australia, and now the company's moved to North Carolina. He's got them in his churches in North Carolina. So we're kind of doing a demonstration over in the other room that kind of goes into a little bit more detail of how that works. But basically, inside this one picture here is like a close-up of one of these boxes without the cover on it. And so there's 81 soft dome high frequency drivers in there, and they each have a 100-watt amplifier behind them. And they have their own channel of DSP. And then immediately behind them, I think you can just kind of see there's 9 mid-range drivers behind that, and they have 200-watt amplifiers and their own channel of DSP. So that's 90 amplifiers inside of that box. And the fans you hear, unfortunately, because this was an earlier model, they're no longer there. So the fans now are unfortunately in this room, but not on the new models of the speakers. And by all those things, they're working all the time. All of those elements are working, and they're working about 30%. So there's lots of headroom in there, and then they're able to steer the sound by that. And we can skew the energy, and now we can put more energy at the back or at the front, however you like, but we can also now skew energy to the left and the right. That's not what other people are able to do well. So that means this is a picture kind of a simulating of a stereo auditorium. That means that the left speaker can throw more energy to the right side of the room. And it doesn't matter where you sit now in this room, and that's the song we were playing when you came in has a lot of good stereo separation on it and that kind of thing. You could be sitting in that back corner over there and still hear the stereo separation as if you were sitting in the center of the room, equidistant between the two speakers. You can have stereo imaging in excess of 80% of the space, and that it just basically made a gigantic sweet spot. So wherever you sit in there, wherever inside of that coverage area, the sound pressure level is going to be the same, and the frequency response is going to be the same. This technology is known as a plane array, and the speakers can be configured to produce three-dimensional wavefronts of any shape. And the second one from the left there, all that red there, that's kind of showing it's able to skew more energy to the far corner and less energy in the front corner. And that can be any of these kind of shapes. It's limitless because we can define what that looks like. Normally, I said, your speakers work like a 60-degree kind of thing, and in a room usually are this way. But we can actually invert that. We can actually make the audience area be a trapezoid where it's a shorter distance in the back and you're covering all of the front here. There's 120 degrees naturally out of there, which means now we could steer the beam 60 degrees left and right, 60 degrees up and down. The other part of this is an app that I'm going to attempt to show you here. And so to talk to all of that stuff there, let's see, let me put this in here like this. They've developed an AR app that is able to give all the parameters that we need to into this space. So there's a couple different ways. I'll show you this first. So the newer iPads, the Pro versions, they have a LiDAR scanning on it. I don't know if you ever saw this, but I can scan the room here like this and slowly come up with, I'll just do this up here just to give you an example of, oh, there's some up here. Okay, let's do that. So I can make a 3D model. You could walk into your church. Let's see how long this will take. Let's go like fast. You can go into your church and scan all the walls and come up with a 3D model of your stuff. So here, if I go in here, let's see now. I can go in here and now I can spin around. I can zoom in on this. This would be a whole room, you could say. I could show you, if I go back over here maybe. Here's an example of my church out in Sierra Madre here. And so I could scan this room, and we're going to put in a couple speakers in here. And now I can come out of the augmented reality into virtual reality and put the speakers exactly where I want and plan exactly where my audience level is going to be. So let me go into his software here. Let's do this. It's a little bit hard tethered to here. Okay, so what we've done here, let me just make a couple adjustments like this. So I can move this around and put the speakers where we would want them in the room there. Okay, the magic though is on this side of the room. As I point out to you guys, that's the actual audience area that we are targeting. And so I can either go and walk the room and put 4 points in the room, or I can shutter this in and say, all right, let's bring this down here. I need to cover this part of the audience here. The back edge is back here. And now I can define exactly what the space is that we're getting. Now, that's not going to hit the walls if I can keep it off there. And it does a whole bunch of calculations in here. That's what that pink is. And it gives me approximate SPL level. At 1.6 we're at 106 with this shape here kind of thing with the speakers. And we can go in and change. And then it predicts what the level is so that everything is completely equal, the sound pressure level wherever you go. Then I would go and walk that space, and it has a built-in sweep generator, like you guys that have tuned your rooms. Then we can go and push by Bluetooth to the speaker, and I'll do 5 readings, random readings in this space, and it does all that math and calculations and spits it all back, and then now we've kind of flat-tuned the room in like 5 minutes time. So I can show a little bit more of that, but it just shows the control that we have. And the other thing is we can have, oops, sorry, I'm making you dizzy. We can do 4 different beams out of the same speaker. And so for example, if you had a balcony and you wanted to keep the energy off the back wall, you would cover one beam would be on the floor, and the other beam might be up in the, just to cover the balcony area. Let me go back into here. All right. Oh, it got confused because it doesn't have a a monitor to look at. Let's go back like this. And all right. Okay. And now I got to go and find my slide here. Sorry. Okay. So we can make any audience shape that we desire. It could be rectangular, octagonal, and it basically does all that math for you and figures out exactly what the speaker needs to do to keep that energy off the walls and with minimal reflections as possible. So that's kind of just a sneak peek into that technology, but I want to give you guys some other tips as well in terms of other stuff that you may have. Because some people may say, well, I don't have enough money to be able to buy a LiDAR scanner to scan your whole room or whatever and optimize things for me. Well, then the first tip would be, well, try and minimize the point sources that you have in your space. This makes a big difference. If you can get away with one speaker or two speakers covering your room instead of 16, well, it's going to greatly improve the sound quality of your room by eliminating those comb filters here. One thing about this technology is even though there's two speakers on this side, they're actually acting as one. With a line array, we talked about all those different point sources and all of the comb filtering that happens. Well, it doesn't matter as many as these we put together, it remains as one point source. So it's as if you just built a bigger speaker. So we could put like 8 of these together and now it's still one point source. So now we're down to 4 comb filters if I just got a stereo set inside of here like this. Other ways to reduce the number of point sources in your room would be maybe try in-ear monitors if you can afford them instead of the floor wedges, because every speaker you take out, you can square root then the number of comb filters that are happening in the room. So that'll give you better coverage that way. The next thing is to remember to try to keep the energy off of the walls where you can. The more you can keep the sound energy off the walls, the less listener fatigue people are going to have. And how do we do that with existing speakers, like here or something? Well, by placing them as high as you can in the room, if they're not permanently installed, that will increase the angle of the sound as it bounces up so that it'll go more into the ceiling. If you had it more shallow here, it's just going to hit the back wall. So that's a way, by relocating those speaker positions, you can get them to get that angle so where there's not, and that'll keep some of that energy off of the walls. It's also helpful that, like in this room, they have the sound treatments on the walls. But there are some churches, Catholic churches especially, that you're not able to do this because it's got ancient architecture there and stained glass windows. So that's really where this technology helps out, because now you can keep all of that additional sound from coming off of the walls. Use the proper gain structure on your mixing channels. If you have the gain set too low, you'll get tons of noise. If it's too high, you'll get clipping and distortion happening. That's another tip for improving your existing system. Using the proper mics with the correct pickup patterns. That's basically where your mic is listening to the sounds. And we could spend an entire session talking about that. So you want to use the correct tool for the job. Drum mics where they're used and vocal mics where they're used. Other big thing is subwoofers. A lot of people have bottom end issues, and it might be really loud in the center like it would be here because we have these subwoofers right here in front. The reason why is because often people like to do stereo subs, a left and a right sub, which is fine. You can do that. We do it all the time. It just makes something called, it creates what's called a dipole. And the energy is loudest when you're in between those two sources. So as soon as you step outside of one point, the bottom end reduces, and then you start getting cancellation. And so then if you have two subs, there's less energy to the outside and lots of sub-energy to the inside. So how do we fix that? Well, we push these to the outside walls, and it also helps a little bit if you load it into a corner. The bass frequencies react a bit better, and now you've kind of spread that out, because sub-frequencies are hard to steer, although we can do it with if you saw the subwoofers up here, there's like 3 12-inch subs in one of these cabinets. If you put 3 of these cabinets together, now you can start steering sub, but it ends up being not really cost effective, and bass goes where it wants to go, and you guys end up just dealing with it. And the final thing, I think, is really tackling that THD. And the only way you can really get rid of distortion is to use as small as compression driver as you can that's possible. And if you can, get a box that uses a soft tone system. And that's why in these, there's 81 of those high frequency drivers in there, so that we can still get the same SPL level as a compression driver would get, but you don't get any of that distortion. So the biggest sound quality improvement you ever get is just removing that distortion, and then when you're playing that music track, now they'll be much, much more similar. You won't have the same effect as with the compression drivers in there. Let's see. So I hope that helps. In closing, God went through a great effort to communicate with us in the person of Jesus Christ. And we've now been entrusted with a great responsibility of now getting that gospel message out loud and clear. And it's our duty to do that as effectively as possible in that task. And what you guys are working with every day in your mission that you have. I can be available to answer any questions, or there may be some that we have here that it looks like we finished a little bit early, but.
What do these cost?
So let's see. Each of these boxes is about $14,000, but everything is inside of it that you need. There's no amplifiers that are needed, and no external DSP stuff for this. It's just you put your mixing board into it, and everything else goes from there.
Did you really need 4 of them for this room?
This room, we may have been able to get rid of 2 of them and done 2, but we wanted to make sure, since we'd never been in this room before, that we would use 4 here. If you have a live drum set, it's probably better to go. Well, let me start back. There's smaller versions of these also. If I don't have a picture of it, maybe it was over here. They're actually, if you segmented that into thirds, there's a 30 driver module that or speaker, and those are about $7,000 each. And so we're covering the chapel out in at Church on the Way in Van Nuys with just 2 of the smaller speakers, and it's probably maybe half the size of this room kind of thing. It's a little divided. You could do, if you wanted, you could do a center cluster like this. It kind of just depends on the dynamics or the geometry of your room a little bit, but there's some benefits. Stereo comes into play in churches not too often. However, depending on who you talk to, there's people like, yeah, I want to do stereo, and I want to be able to pan my instruments and that kind of thing, and it just doesn't normally happen. Well, now, since we can make it in equal SPL level throughout the whole room, well, stereo becomes viable again, in which case then going to the outside would be a better choice. The other thing, just on the technology, I guess, a little bit, is one of those boxes is steering the beam to horizontally and vertically to 1 kilohertz and above. If I put 2 of those boxes together, I double the size on it. Well, now I can bring that down to 500 hertz. So this is actually steering left to right in the room only to 1 kilohertz, but front to back, it's able to steer all the way to 500. So by putting this in the corner, there is a hard edge or the edge of the beam that's coming out of them at some point. So I can angle those in, and usually, you know, there's an aisle on the corner. I can angle that in more to the center, and now the natural fall off, in addition to what I'm steering, is staying off of the walls. So it's another benefit to kind of pushing those into the corner. Yes, sir.
Our church is trying to put some sound paneling up, but the sound team wants to put paneling just behind the band.
Mm-hmm.
Too much for reducing the bouncing. We don't have any panels on the back wall, but they want to put them up there.
Well, it would probably help a little bit here, especially if you've got drums and stuff around and that kind of thing. But I would say more importantly, it's the position of where your speakers are and what they're doing in the room. Because, I mean, even these panels are only absorbent in certain frequencies. So it's really about, if we can keep the energy off the walls in the first place, then you will get your most drastic stuff, effect on that. The church that I showed you had the 3D model of it. They had carpet in there. They had pews that had cushions on them, and all that went away. Or the cushions are back, but they took out the carpet because it's got this beautiful hardwood floor underneath it. Well, that room is just so reverberant now, and there's no room to put panels on the wall. They got all the stained glass windows and stuff. So by being able to put in this kind of steerable technology, that it hopefully will be able to get things a little bit better there. They ended up putting some sound treatment under the pews. So you don't, if you looked underneath, you see that. So that kind of is absorbing some of it, but it's just not as effective. It's just very live room. And gymnasiums are the same way. If we can keep it off and only direct onto the ears.
Do you need any special power requirements for those?
No, this is running off of, we probably could put, I would say 2 or 3 on, or I might be able to get 4 on a 20 amp circuit. It also depends on how loud of a your worship band is. Yes, sir.
I have a question for you, kind of unrelated.
Okay.
So I've noticed even at the good setup they have here today, they were getting some microphone feedback when they were performing earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in a part of a mobile church, and the sound isn't great because we just have a 4-speaker basic setup. But one of the main issues is that. Do you know what the standard cause of that is and how you can stop it?
Well, traditionally, in all the places you always have the speakers in front of the microphones. With this technology, it's very feedback resistant, actually, because we're steering the beam to where we want it to be. Now, there was no other place in here to put them but to put them there just to have this worked. Yeah.
Out of a auditorium at a high school.
Uh-huh.
High school, you're in almost the same place, maybe more towards the stage.
Yeah.
I do notice we get mic feedback.
Yes, and again, if these were stacked side by side next to each other, well, now we'd be steering to 500 hertz because there's 500 and above. So there's everything below 1,000 is still coming off in the natural 120 to here. So they're having to deal with that part of it in this room. But with a larger array, then we can get that down where it's not. And we just did a church in Dallas, and the pastor was walking around. It's like half the size of this also. And they were just amazed. They just cranked the volume in there, and he was walking around with his handheld mic and singing at the top of his lungs, and I sound the same back here as I do over here. And so it's the feedback, keeping the sound only where we want it. So when you install these, there's a lot of, as we kind of found out, there's a lot of challenges that come into play with this. Okay, we got this great speaker system. Okay, but the board is set up to deal with what your old system sounded like. And we could do an A/B in here, but I think we've run out of time. But
The feedback today was because of location.
yes, because we're only steering to 1,000, so some of that stuff was still coming here. So there was a little bit just depending on where they were.
Where would they need to be moved to?
In this room, this is a really wide room. I mean, those seats there, I don't know that I really can cover them, even though they do a great job at covering that kind of thing. If we had covered this more traditionally, maybe, then the feedback wouldn't have been an issue today, even though we're only steering to 1,000. But because of that position, plus the fact that we're trying to cover, and I wanted to have it be as wide as possible because I wanted to have as much stereo as I could to be able to simulate that for you. And so those things adding together. The other thing is all of the EQ that now everybody came in, the bands that are coming in with they're used to EQing the microphones and the instruments the way that they are, but that EQ is compensating for their system back at home. And now this room was flat when we started, and so they had to add a little bit more into it as to however you like it. If you like it brighter, if you like it a little bit less. So they're doing a great job just trying to keep ahead of it. They've never heard any sound out of these speakers.
You can do to at least help a little bit with the feedback then.
Well, it would be speaker position and then how you're driving that. So the microphones here, if they would have came in and made them all flat and then trimmed up from there, but when you're using a preset that was set for something else, they had to blow away the EQ that they had in the board for this system here because it was overcompensating so much. So, is this over at 4? Is that the next now? Okay. Well, thank you all. I'm going to be available today, the rest of today, over inside where the banquet hall is. And my brother is actually going to be here tomorrow. If you guys have questions, he'll be over in that. And we can kind of show you a little bit more about how we've got a demonstration where you can actually walk through that beam and see how much it's dropping on the sides of that, which is simulating what's on that side of the wall. All right. Thank you, guys.